All right, anatomy, physiology folk. This is lesson 7.06 on the neuromuscular junction. So we need to introduce neurons and talk about those a little bit and see how they interact with skeletal muscle. So this is intended to be kind of the background that you're going to need to understand what we're talking about. When we go through the sliding filament theory, we're going to start with the nerve impulse and we're going to end with the sarcomere going through a full contraction and then relaxing back to its starting state. So there's some terms that you don't have that you're going to need and we're going to be throwing around at the start of this process. Well, first of all, what's a neuron? A neuron is the special cell of the nervous system that allows us to send signals, to communicate through the body, to get things done. Some of our neurons are voluntary, some of our neurons are involuntary, and motor always refers to movement. So a motor neuron is a neuron that's job is to cause movement, and in this case, to contract the muscle. Let's focus up here. It's a little blurry. What we see here, you'll notice it says spinal cord. Well, it probably would be a good idea to have, and this is the brain coming up. My brains always look like smiley faces. So we've got the brain up here, and maybe you decide you want to pick up your pencil. Yeah, I know that's not a very good brain. You want to pick up your pencil. So we send a signal from the brain down the spinal cord where it hits this motor neuron. And neurons have this general shape. And we're going to do this again in much more detail later. You've heard that a time or two, where they've got these long processes that come out. We're going to call those dendrites. And they have ends that come down like this. So what we have here is the dendrites in the cell body, and then the signal travels down this motor neuron, and these motor neurons can be really, really long, till it gets to the end of the neuron, and we've got these little knobs at the end. They're called synaptic knobs. And each one of these knobs is attached to a different skeletal muscle fiber, and remember, a muscle fiber is a muscle cell. So this one motor neuron can fire, in this case, we're counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, actually up to maybe 50 to 100 muscle fibers. So we have one motor neuron. Whoops. Got some white out. One motor neuron can fire tens to hundreds of muscle fibers, which is the same thing as a cell. So we call the neuron and all the fibers that it fires a motor unit. It's called a motor unit. Again, a motor unit is a motor neuron and all of the muscle fibers that it fires. So which is kind of what we have represented here. Well, let's zoom in. So I'm going to circle this, and let's kind of do an expanded version over here. The other thing is, I'm also looking at this. I could say it's this too. So the end of a neuron has this kind of a shape. And this is called the synaptic knob. And if you were in psychology, you've done all of this already. It's also sometimes called the axon terminal. Axon terminal just means the end of an axon, and this long structure here is going to be called an axon. So, axon terminal. This is more of a directional thing where it just means end of the axon. When we're talking about the synaptic knob, we're talking about the actual area that terminates, is at the end of the axon. You have something on the other side of this synaptic knob. So It could be a lot of different things. So on the other side, we could have another nerve. But in this case, what we have is we have a muscle fiber. What's the muscle fiber the same as? A muscle cell. Yep. So sometimes these nerves will go nerve to nerve. Sometimes it'll go nerve to muscle. And in this case, we're talking about having a muscle fiber on the other side. In either case, you always have a gap. And that gap is called a synapse. Actually, I take that back. Got your whiteout handy? A better way to say that is the synapse is the whole kit and caboodle. It's the synaptic knob, the gap, and what's on the other side. So this whole arrangement is a synapse. The gap would actually be called the synaptic cleft. So this gap is called synaptic cleft. Well, why do we bother? Why not just have them have a direct connection? Well, because it's a little bit like think about, you may not know much about trains, but if you go to a railroad station, there's switching stations where if a train comes in, they'll spin it around on a platform and it can connect to a different set of rails. We need to be able to do that with our nerves. We don't want just one pathway. We need to be able to form, maybe you want to go from nerve A to B to C, but then you need to go from nerve A to D to F. And you need to have a different connection. So having these synapses allows our nerve impulses to go in different directions, just like we send trains in different directions in a rail yard. So while at the front end it might look like it's a little bit inefficient, having these gaps, it allows us to turn on and turn off pathways, kind of like circuit breakers in your house, or light switches in your house. Maybe you want the light on, but maybe the light needs to be off. So it provides us with directional ability, and it provides us with turning things off and on. That's morning. I'm drinking my coffee. Well, how do we get a signal across? We're going to talk about this in very general terms. On this side, I'm going to have receptors of some kind. So on the downside, we have receptors for a neurotransmitter. So I have these neurotransmitters, and a neurotransmitter, let's define that. And I'm going to do neurotransmitters in light green. So neurotransmitter. A neurotransmitter is a chemical that carries a neural impulse across a synaptic cleft. And binds to receptors on the opposite side. We're going to get into neurotransmitters in more detail when we do nerve tissue, when we do physiology of nerves. But there's all kinds of categories. Some of them make you happy. Sometimes if you don't have enough of them, you feel sad. They control your emotions. They control your involuntary processes. In this case, we're talking about the neurotransmitter that controls movement. So because I did neurotransmitter in green, I'm going to put it in, and they exist in these little vesicles. So remember, a vesicle is just a phospholipid bilayer. And when we're ready to fire a signal, well, these vesicles will move to the end of the synaptic knob. They'll fuse with the membrane and they'll release their neurotransmitter into the gap. So maybe this guy comes down and fuses and releases his stuff in the gap. And then the neurotransmitter travels across the gap and binds to receptors on the other side. So those are kind of the general things that we're going to talk about when we start talking about getting this whole process started. So let's do our takeaways here. We titled this lesson the neuromuscular junction, which is the area right here where we have the muscle cells and the nerve cells interfacing. So the neuromuscular junction, if we wanted to expand it, is right here. But it's made up of we have a motor unit, which is one motor neuron and all of the muscle fibers that it fires. And that could be a lot. It can fire a lot of muscle fibers. If we look at the junction where the neuron meets the muscle fiber, we'll see that we have a synaptic knob filled with vesicles of neurotransmitter. We have a cleft that separates that from whatever's on the other side. And in this case, we're talking about muscle fibers. Um, and what happens is the neurotransmitter gets released, travels across the synaptic cleft, binds with the receptors, and causes something to happen on the other side. In the case of shortening a sarcomere, it's going to, or in case of muscle contraction, it's going to cause the sarcomeres to shorten. All right, so that was your crash course on the neuron and a synapse. So I think in the next video, we are finally ready to start talking about this process. And just as a heads up, it'll probably be part 1, part 2, part 3. All right, guys, that's all for now. I'm hitting